The first sound was water. Not a rush or a pour. Just the clean, steady drop that insists on counting the dark. Caleb Sutter lay on something that pretended to be a bed and failboards as narrow as a church pew and twice as unforgiving. He was cold enough that his jaw ached when it clicked. His tongue felt like a strip of leather left out in the sun. If a man had offered him a cup then and there, Caleb might have traded anything he owned. He might have killed for it, if he'd been able to stand without the room tilting like a boat. "Hello?" he managed, and the word came out as a dry scrape. "Anybody there?" A voice answered. Familiar, if thin around the edges. "Keep your voice low." "Lydia?" he whispered. The name steadied him more than the walls did. A bell chimed somewhere beyond his door, one clean note. Then another followed by iron speaking to stone as a mechanism woke and remembered its purpose. The slab that sealed his cell shuddered and began to move. Through the widening seam crawled a needle of warm light. It stabbed his eyes, painting the dark with red and green ghosts. "Don't talk yet," the girl said. She lifted the candle higher. In its glow she was a tall shadow, spare as a fence post. She wore a gray homespun shift that was damp at the hem and smudged like a mechanic's rag. In one hand, she held a handleless tin cup. A wicker basket leaned against her bare shin. When she stepped closer, the light found the iron cuff around her ankle and the polished sphere chained to it, scarred with the stories of every step she'd taken down there. Caleb flinched. "They've got you." Lydia Finch shook her head and pressed a finger to her lips. Then she did something he didn't expect. She set the candle on the floor, hummed a tuneless scrap of an old song, dipped a rag into a bucket he hadn't seen her bring, and wrung it high over the water so that the drips clattered loud. The humming wasn't music. It was cover, sound to fill the cracks where whispers could leak. When she finally bent to him, her eyes were bright, not with fever, but with calculation. "You look worse than I told them." "I hate being called a liar," he said, and tried to smile. It went sideways on his face. "Drink." She put the cup to his mouth and tilted. The water was shockingly cold. He swallowed too fast and choked and laughed and drank again. "It's clean," she said, drawn fresh from a cistern. Everyone here's real proud of their cisterns. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. The skin there was split from the cold. "How long?" "Hard to say. With no sun. A few weeks. A month maybe." She glanced toward the door as she wrung the rag again. "They don't let me above." "They?" "The men who run this place call themselves the Men of the Rock." She made a face at the name as if it tasted like stale bread. "They love a capital letter." Caleb listened to the water drip. The stones breathe. Lydia hum. The world was exactly 3 colors: candle gold, old iron black, and the patient wet gray of walls that had never seen a summer. He closed his eyes and saw, as he often did, a grid overlaying whatever room. He found himself in lines of force and habit, the ways people moved or were moved. Even down here, that instinct worked. Counting, mapping, filing away the hinge that squealed, the lag between bell and slide, the slant where the water chose a path. "You didn't answer what I didn't ask," he said softly. "The chain." She tilted her ankle, as if to inspect a scuff on a shoe. "Decoration," she said. "I suppose I could be flattered." He looked at her. She looked back. Steady. The humming went on. "The bell opens this one door," she said, nodding toward the slab. "I don't have a key. I have permission, which is a different thing and harder to misuse." "Who gave you that?" "Deacon Hobbs thinks I make less trouble if I'm busy." The way she said the deacon's name made it sound like a tool, something you use until it breaks. "I told him you'd die if someone didn't tend your fever." "So you told the truth." Caleb cleared his throat and felt the nails-on slate pain of it. "That still works. Sometimes." "In a town that worships a piece of geology?" Lydia snorted. "You'd be surprised what works." He frowned. "A town?" "Farm. Town. Order. Depends on who you ask and if they're trying to sell you a bushel of apples or an afterlife. They're out here in Pennsylvania somewhere, but you'll never find a map that says so. And if you go hunting, you won't find your way twice. Ask me how I know." He didn't ask. He had his own story about that. Years back, when Caleb Sutter was traveling under the name Gideon Parish, he'd heard about a community that grew acres of straight-row miracles and still hitched horses to their pride. A place where the roads curved around you if they didn't like your questions. The rumors were what caught him. Not the prurient ones, the lazy gossip that always blooms wherever people dress different and keep to themselves, but the technical ones. A patch of land where a radio wouldn't hold a station and a compass spun like a drunk. A stone house that handled more than sermons. A motto, the rock provides. Caleb was a man who depended on the part of the world other people didn't notice. He had a knack for feeling the hinge in a system. The seam. He could walk into a corrupt county office and know which clerk needed a new roof, which deputy had a daughter in trouble, which judge kept his flask under the left side of his bench. Folks called that charisma or luck. It wasn't either. It was patience and a set of questions he asked himself without moving his lips. He'd gone looking. The morning he presented himself at a town square and climbed into a wagon with a dozen men who needed work and were honest enough to admit it. He'd told himself the worst that could happen was he'd spend a day hauling gourds and walk away with a sore back and a story. The men put canvas sacks over their passengers' heads and tied them snug. And Caleb's breath brought him the smell of old grain and whatever it is that lives forever in burlap. He'd rolled his shoulders and smiled to himself, because usually that kind of thing didn't matter. You could close his eyes, and he could still see the pattern of the room. But not that day. The dark in the sack wasn't the kind you carry with you. It was a place. He'd felt it clamped down. When they took the sacks off, what he saw would have seduced any man who grew up poor and suspicious. Order everywhere. Neat as a ledger. Straight rows. Clean barns. Teams picking and picking, no waste. No swagger. No slack. And yet not mean about it. Buildings laid out as if someone who understood the math of breath had done the measuring. He'd admired it even as he cataloged its weaknesses. Because that was his habit. He'd turned on his best version of friendly. Because if there was a man alive who could talk his way into a back room, it was Caleb Sutter under whatever name he chose that day. He'd complimented the woman with the ledger. He'd held himself the way men do when they're trying to look smaller in a place that makes them feel big. He'd been caught anyway. Not by his smile or his lie, but by a force he couldn't see. Two broad men who'd stepped forward with the same step and said, without heat, that the name he'd given didn't belong to him, and neither did anything else here. He remembered the shame-hot heat in his neck at being red and the quiet of the world as the blackjack found the notch at the base of his skull. He'd woken in a park with a knot on his head and a bus going nowhere. More interesting than the headache was the problem that followed. Every time he tried to find that farm again, the roads politely removed themselves from his reach. He'd laughed at the magic of that until the fifth try, when laughter felt like a man whistling to keep his nerve. He'd put it down as a note in the margin. There are places that choose not to be visited twice. Now the place had chosen him. Tell me the rules, he said, before somebody else does and charges me for the privilege. Lydia leaned back on her heels. The chain drew a neat half-circle on the floor. She spoke as if she were reciting something and mocking it at the same time. They say the rock sees and the rock provides. They say the women study. They say the road is a temptation and the telephone an abomination. They tell outsiders that humility is their virtue and that the old ways are safety. And what do they tell themselves? That none of the old names fit, she said, and her voice lost its mockery for a moment. That they came here with their crimes and their failures, and the earth took them in anyway. The rock covers a multitude of sins. They built their lives around that. Some of them do kindness with it. Others built a ladder up to a room where they keep the doors locked from both sides. He watched her face. It didn't change when she said that. Who keeps the keys? Elder Abram Cross, she said, and men like him. Deacon Hobbs shares the work of making sure people do what the rock would do if the rock had hands. And you? Caleb said. What did you do to earn your iron? Lydia's mouth curved in a way that wasn't a smile and wasn't not. Survived here when I wasn't supposed to. Said the wrong words in the right order. Knew something about pressure and flow that the brethren want to think is blasphemy. Not physics. The bell in the hall rang again. But it wasn't the neat chime that had opened the door. It was a deep, wrung-out boom, as if someone had struck iron with an iron opinion. Chains followed in its wake. The slab shuddered and moaned another inch. Time, she said. The word didn't mean hours. It meant consequences. The man who filled the doorway carried a lantern that he used as if light were a weapon. He was a square-shouldered, broad-jawed body wearing a face like a plow that had hit too many stones. His hair had gone gray not by his choice, and he had decided to make that the world's problem. There were scars on his knuckles that had been earned the old way. Deacon Hobbs, Lydia said without warmth. He's awake. I can see that, the deacon said, though he looked at Caleb as one looks at a gun to decide if it's loaded. He needs a doctor, Lydia said, or he will be a problem you can't fix with a hymn. Doctors are men who listen to themselves talk about the body's complaints. Hobbs said, we have workmen. We have the rock. We have women who study and know which herbs to use and which not. He shifted the lantern and glanced at Lydia's ankle. You have already made yourself an exception in too many things. He won't walk far without help, Lydia said. Hobbs weighed that, then shifted his jaw and stepped aside grudgingly. On your own heads be the hurt. Then, Elder Cross will have words. Move. Lydia slipped under Caleb's shoulder and took his weight. He had expected to drag her. Instead, she steadied him with a practical strength that didn't advertise itself. He felt the chain at her ankle move, accounted for it, and placed his feet where it would not catch. They took the stairs slowly. The walls changed from raw to finished. The water noises gathered themselves into something like a voice and then lost it again. On the last landing, Hobbs paused and turned to Caleb with the careful attention a man gives a snake he needs to pick up and cannot afford to fear. You're a name we've heard, he said. Not the one you keep on your tongue. The one strangers use when they scald their mouths with their own ambitions. I have had names, Caleb said. They fit and they didn't. Same as coats. You have one now, Hobbs said. The elder will tell you what it is. They came out into a long room with a flagstone floor that had been laid with more love than money. A dozen oil lamps hung at measured intervals. Their light made pools that overlapped. At the far end was a desk that had grown from the floor thick. Plain. A thing built to outlast argument. Behind it sat a man whose beard was the neat kind and whose eyes were a color that forgave everything except pride. Elder Cross, Hobbs said. The elder held up a hand without doing anything so rude as to cut his deacon off. He had the sort of authority that didn't need volume. When he finally looked at Caleb, it was the look a craftsman gives a tool he has read about but never held. You've been called Granger. Parrish. Tate. Cross said. We will call you what you are. And what's that? Caleb asked mildly. A man who makes rooms behave. Cross said. A specialist in the weakness that lives at the hinge. You came sniffing round our fields once, and the rock turned you back. Did you think it had forgotten your tread? I hoped you had, Caleb said, but I never thought the rock had thoughts. Hope is the first refuge of the clever, Cross said. It is not the rocks. The rock abides. He folded his hands. You interfered before. We lifted you out of our order and placed you back on a bench in a town that does not know us. We ask small. Mr. Sutter. We ask to work how we must without being the subject of idle men's appetites. You violated that. Our patience is a well, but it has a bottom. Is this where I apologize? Caleb said. Or do we skip to the part where I'm useful to you in one way or another? Cross smiled slightly. You are ill and injured. You are also not a fool. We are not a people of torture. What we do is simpler and more thorough. We show a man his edges and invite him to choose where he belongs. His eyes flicked to Lydia. The girl has made her choices for too long. If you want a confession, Deacon Hobbs knows how to wring water from a stone, Lydia said, and the way she said it made clear that Hobbs had once tried to wring a prayer from her and failed. Cross ignored the bait. The fields will need work through the first frost. The cisterns sit low. The pressure beneath the stone house must be managed as the season changes, or we will have what we had in 31. What did you have in 31? Caleb asked. Deaths we could have prevented if we had understood what we honored. Cross said simply. We understand more now. Lydia is part of that. Lydia's chin lifted the smallest fraction. You keep me because I make your valves behave. You call them valves. Cross said. We call them what they are, organs. The rock breathes. The rock drinks. We tend it. If its breath is wrong, it counts our mistakes in bodies. If its drink is fouled, we get sick. And our children bury us before they have Father's hands. Caleb had walked into 100 zealot rooms and had learned the look that told him which kind of faith lived there. With Cross, he saw none of the rabid light. He saw the practical devotion of a man who had decided to believe whatever fed the greatest number of his people in the lean years. He might be wrong. He might be wicked. But he was not sloppy. What do you want from me? Caleb asked. Your name seems to have an appetite for rooms. Cross said. Ours is a room we have made from the earth itself. There are passages beneath our feet that existed before we arrived. And there are ones we cut with our own hands. Ignorant hands that made mistakes and then learned. We need you to walk where we tell you and tell us what happens to the air that men breathe and the water that women draw. Lydia has a sense for it. He paused. But the men will not follow her down until she has a sponsor they can stomach. You want me to go with her? Caleb said, and couldn't help the laugh that hurt when it came. Bring a witch where the rock's breath is thin. Cross's mouth didn't move. Names matter here because names tell men where to put their fear. Yours will serve to keep the worst kinds of fear in a room I can lock. Lydia's eyes slid to Caleb for an instant, then away. And when the work is done, she said, does my name go back to the chain on my ankle? Or do I get to choose anything that doesn't smell like dank rags? Cross said nothing for a long 3 heartbeats. Then he lifted one hand and made a small gesture that might have been a blessing if it had been directed toward heaven instead of the floor. The rock keeps oaths, he said, if you help us keep the breath smooth and the water sweet through the turn of the season. Lydia Finch will walk this property without iron on her bones. That is my word. Hobbs made a small disapproving sound with his teeth. Cross did not hear it. Caleb had learned that men who cared about words enough to polish them could still break them cleanly when it suited the ledger. He had also learned that if a community believes a thing about itself long enough, we keep our oaths. We don't gossip. We pay our debts. The narrative becomes a tool you can use. He made a note behind his eyes. If they betray her, they'll ruin more than a girl. They'll ruin a story they need to live with themselves. All right, he said. I'll walk your lungs. Cross nodded once, as if a plan that had already gone into effect had not changed direction, but simply continued as intended. Go then, he said. Deacon, take them to the east lift. Hobbs looked as if he had swallowed a handful of gravel. Yes, Elder. They went down again, deeper than Caleb would have guessed this land could hold and still keep its feet dry. The air adopted a weight that wanted to sit on a man's chest like a child. The light made a long taper and then was a suggestion rather than a fact. Lydia moved with assurance that made her chain seem theatrical. Like a prop. She taught him how to step, so the rock gave back rather than taking. She pointed, without pointing, to shafts where air tried to ask and was denied. She told him to stop when the sound changed. And it did. The drip became a rush. Then a whisper. Then a hiss so fine it felt like glass dust. Here, she said, and crouched where the wall pinched to a waist, and the floor sloped as if the world had been built by a man with one leg longer than the other. They call this a throat. What do you call it? He asked. An hourglass laid on its side. She said, everything wants to move from high to low. All we do is decide how fast it's allowed to obey that wish. How do you do that? By not pretending that wishing is a plan. She pointed to a set of stones mortared together with something darker than grout. What happens if that seam pops? Pressure goes where it wants, which is everywhere at once until it finds your eardrums. We'll be dead, and they'll say the rock chose. And you don't like your choices attributed to geology, he said. I don't like men who shove a woman down a well and tell each other God pushed. They worked. The work was slow and physical and exacting. Caleb's gifts were not magic in the fairy tale way these men distrusted. They were an old carpenter's instincts, transferred to breath and flow and habit. What squeaks, what binds, What swells in the wet and shrinks in the dry. He learned the valve handles that wanted to be coaxed, not yanked, and the ones that required a two-handed stubbornness. He learned the sulk of a passage that had been cut wrong and remedied poorly and now carried hurt like a badly healed bone. Between one adjustment and the next, Lydia said, as if dropping the sentence into a pocket, they think they need to feed it. Feed what? He said. The rock. She said. When the seasons turn. When the pressure stutters. They think the rock hungers and will be satisfied with somewhere else's pain. They don't put it like that. They use scriptural words. Sacrifice. Cleansing. I don't have patience with old blood making the world run. I'd rather bleed my own hands and put things right. How often? He asked. Often enough that they keep the chain tight. She said. Not often enough that the women can't hide each other when the calendar draws close. Elder Cross hates the ritual. He also fears the years when he denied it. Men who say they're pragmatic are often just men who have run out of imagination. Caleb adjusted a wheel until he felt the air's temper change. A draft found a path. The hissing eased. He breathed deeper and for the first time felt his hunger return. Let's say I'm a man with imagination, he said. What should I fear? Thinking you can do this once, she said, and then leave without the score, trying to balance in your absence. They made the round, east to west, then south, pausing often because the work didn't want applause. It wanted attention. Twice Lydia wrapped his hands when a handle bit him. Once he kept her from stepping into a pool that looked like water and was not. At a place the men called the organ because the rock there had been shaped to sing, when water ran has stopped, and listened as the world they were maintaining tuned itself. Beautiful, he said despite himself. That sound cost us 5 boys and 31. Lydia said. I'm glad you like it now that it's safe. Lydia. Hobbs snapped from behind them. Mind your mouth. She didn't turn. Didn't give him the grace of a look. Mind your lungs, she said. You're breathing because we are careful. They emerged hours later into a day that had the gall to be bright. Cross sat on the flagstone floor with his back against the wall, a posture that surprised Caleb, because men like Cross do not like to be seen lower than the men they command. Cross stood when he saw them. He saw Lydia's stride, which had acquired something freer, and he hid his reaction because he was good at that. We'll hold, Lydia said. If the rains don't come in a tantrum, and if your boys don't decide to make improvements without asking me. Cross nodded and looked at Caleb. And you? Your throats are narrow where they should be narrow, Caleb said. Your seams are uglier than they need to be. You have a vent you're calling a closet. Open it twice a day. The world will thank you by not cracking an eardrum. Cross's mouth tugged a suppressed smile or an admission. We will do as you say. Hobbs